In section 8, Hume takes up a very famous philosophical problem that had been much discussed by the time he came to discuss it, and has been much discussed since, which is about the relation between the freedom of the will and the laws of nature, or the regular sequence of events in the universe. So traditionally, there is an opposition in these discussions between those who defend the idea that there is free will, that people have free will, that they can make their own choices, and those who defend the position that people do not really have free will, even if it looks to them like they do. They don't really have free will because every event in the universe is determined by previous events and by the laws of nature. So, if there are laws of nature that govern what kinds of events follow from what other events, and if the universe is a certain way at a certain time, say at the beginning of time or 10 minutes ago or whenever, that should be sufficient, if we think logically, to determine what happens next in the universe. And so that position is known as determinism, that whatever happens in the universe is determined by the laws of nature and the prior states of the universe. And that seems to contradict the view that human beings have free will, because if human beings are determined to make the decisions that they do, then how can they be free to make them? If they're determined, then they're not free, it seems like. Okay, so that's the traditional opposition. Now, when people argue about this today, sort of the first point that they note about it, usually, is that there are roughly 3 positions. There may be other positions as well, but these are the predominant recognizable positions on the topic. So one position is libertarianism. This is the position that we have free will, and that our free will is an exception to determinism. So other parts of the universe might be determined, but human decision-making isn't determined by the laws of nature. And this is a position that a number of different thinkers have held and do hold today. Descartes is an example of a thinker who holds this position. Another position is what's referred to as hard determinism, which is the position that determinism is true, and therefore free will is not possible. Determinism is taken to basically rule out the possibility of free will for the reasons that I just mentioned to you when I was kind of describing the problem. The third possible position is called compatibilism, and compatibilism tries to hold that it's both true that the universe is completely determined and true that humans have free will. And so then the challenge is, how can that be the case? How is it even possible to say that, how is it possible that the universe could be completely determined, but people would still be free? Those two things seem to contradict each other. But compatibilists say they don't actually contradict each other if we understand them the right way. And this is actually Hume's position. So he is going to argue that, as he puts it, people have always actually believed both in free will and in determinism at the same time. And any apparent disagreement about it is just a kind of confusion about words. People haven't really been clear in what they meant by these two words or phrases, freedom or freedom of the will and determinism, and other words that they may use in these discussions. And so he's going to try to clarify things by explaining how both of these things have to be true and how they can be true consistently. So the way that he does this is he considers each doctrine in turn, the doctrine of necessity, as he calls it, and the doctrine of liberty. Basically, the position that everything is determined, including human action, and the position that human decisions are free, which is liberty. And he's going to say again that both are true. So when so he considers each of them in turn, and he makes the argument that, look, it's just so obvious that this is true. It's so obvious that all human actions are determined. I mean, I tell you why. And it's so obvious that all human actions are free, and I'll tell you why, okay? And then in the process of that, he gives some explanation as to how it is that people could think that if one is true, then the other is false, and vice versa, and how anybody could be, feel that they could be opposed to the doctrine of necessity. And he gives a little explanation as to why that is. So regarding the doctrine of necessity, he gives a number of arguments, and it's quite interesting. A number of the arguments are about history and the way that human behavior manifests in history. He gives some arguments about kind of the value of experience in business, that, if human nature wasn't predictable, then how could there even be, you could put it in contemporary terms, if human nature wasn't predictable, how could there even be a field of advertising? Why would advertisers pay so much money to sell products if they weren't able to predict that a particular kind of advertisement would be effective in selling products? So it has to be that human action is predictable to some extent, that human actions, some certain causes in a person's environment have certain effects on their behavior, not with perfect certainty for any individual, but there has to be the possibility of regular causes and effects making a difference to people. And he gives a number of other arguments too. He has a nice example where he says, if a friend of mine that I've engaged in many conversations with and is a very close friend comes to my house, I am as certain that he will not stab me and steal my silverware as I am that the house won't fall down around me. Okay? Like, yeah, I believe the house isn't just going to fall down this afternoon. Why do I believe that? Because I've lived in the house for a long time. It's never fallen down before. I've seen lots of other houses, and they don't just fall down all of a sudden for no reason. And I don't expect this to happen this afternoon either for that reason. And I'm extremely confident of it, right? In the same way, I can be extremely confident that my friend who comes over to have dinner with me isn't going to just stab me. And so there are a lot of cases like that Hume points to about how reliable human behavior actually is, and that we can predict it effectively all the time. So it must be that it follows a kind of regular course, just like other things in nature that we can predict. Hume also notes that a lot of natural systems aren't perfectly predictable. So like the weather, for instance, is hard to predict. You can predict it to some extent, and there are meteorologists who, develop very elaborate mechanisms for being able to give better predictions. The fact that some system is not perfectly predictable doesn't mean that perfectly predictable based on the information we're able to gather about it, like the weather, doesn't mean that it's not completely determined by natural causes. And Hume argues that people who think carefully about these things, he calls them philosophers in comparison with lay people, by which he could mean natural philosophers as well as moral philosophers, that people who think carefully about these things, they don't think that when you roll a die with 6 sides and it comes up 6 and you weren't able to predict that it would come up 6 rather than any of the other 5 sides, they don't think that it's coming up 6 is a matter of pure chance. They think that, yes, they don't have enough information to tell exactly how the dice will fall, and they don't have enough information to predict based on a way that the dice is thrown and the way that the wind is moving, exactly on what part of the die it will fall when it hits the table, and exactly how many times it will bounce and where it will fall, so that a 6 will be showing on the up side of the dice. They don't know all those things, but they don't doubt for a minute that everything that happens with the die is happening according to laws of nature and is fully determined by laws of nature. Okay, so that's Hume's description of sort of what people who think carefully about these matters must think about it. On that basis, the fact that the die is unpredictable is just like the fact that human beings are sometimes unpredictable in some respects, right? You don't know for certain exactly what somebody will do, but nonetheless, you can predict it in many cases, and even when you can't predict it, you don't doubt that it's due to some natural causes that they do what they do. Regarding the doctrine of liberty, Hume says much less, but he does note, starting out, that no one means by liberty complete caprice, complete arbitrariness. They don't mean that human decision-making has no connection with motives or inclinations or circumstances. They must think that people, even if people decide, they may have reasons for what they decide. Even if they decide, they may have preferences. They decide, but they decide in a context where they're paying attention to the context, and the context makes a difference to what they decide. So he says liberty can't be incompatible with those kind of features which speak to something like necessity, or at least causal regularity at work in human decision making. But then he goes on to say, by liberty, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. That is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we also may. Now, this hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. Here, then, is no subject of dispute. So what he's basically claiming here is that even people who believe that the universe is completely determined won't deny that humans have a power of acting according to the determinations of their will. That if they choose to remain at rest, they will, and if they choose to move, they will. So a question that we can ask here is, has Hume actually described liberty and necessity in a way where the two are compatible with each other? Or do you think that in some sense his compatibilism fails to be coherent, that there's something about the way he's described liberty that it actually isn't compatible with the universe following a necessary course? And finally, Hume does, in the process of laying out his arguments, both for the doctrine of necessity and the doctrine of liberty, he does offer a deeper explanation for this controversy, and also a kind of resolution by virtue of giving that explanation. And so I will just read it to you here. It's on the slide as a quotation. I have frequently considered what could possibly be the reason why all mankind, though they have ever without hesitation acknowledged the doctrine of necessity in their whole practice and reasoning, have yet discovered such a reluctance to acknowledge it in words, and have rather shown a propensity in all ages to profess the contrary opinion. The matter, I think, may be accounted for after the following manner. If we examine the operations of body and the production of effects from their causes, we shall find that all our faculties can never carry us farther in our knowledge of this relation than barely to observe that particular objects are constantly conjoined together, and that the mind is carried by a customary transition from the appearance of one to the belief of the other. So he's basically reiterating what he said earlier about cause and effect in the external world, in the observed world. He's saying if we examine things, we find that our belief in this cause and effect, in what you might call the necessity or necessary relation between causes and effects, is just based on an experience of things being constantly conjoined together, and the custom or habit of expecting them that we form on that basis. But though this conclusion concerning human ignorance be the result of the strictest scrutiny of this subject, men still entertain a strong propensity to believe that they penetrate farther into the powers of nature, and perceive something like a necessary connection between the cause and the effect. So what he means there is that when philosophers have usually described the doctrine of necessity, when they've usually described determinism, they've thought that what they were describing was some kind of causal power that was in the world itself, rather than just their expectation that things will continue to follow the patterns that they have before. When again they turn their reflections towards the operations of their own minds and feel no such connection of the motive and the action, they are apt to suppose that there's a difference between the effects which result from material force and those which arise from thought and intelligence. So, in other words, these philosophers, they think that out in the world there's some kind of necessary connection between events. Then when they look at their own thoughts, their sequence of thoughts, or the sequence of their thoughts and then their actions, it feels less necessarily connected to them than what they believe is the case out in the world, or what they falsely or mistakenly or unjustifiably infer to be the case out in the world. So when they look inside their own decision making, the connection between their choices and their actions, or one choice and another choice, one thought and another thought, they see less necessary connection than what they believe is out in the world, even though they haven't actually perceived it out in the world. And this leads them to think that they themselves are free, unlike events in the world. But then this is the final point of Hume's reasoning here. He says, but being once convinced that we know nothing farther of causation of any kind than merely the constant conjunction of objects and the consequent inference of the mind from one to another, and finding that these two circumstances are universally allowed to have place in voluntary actions, we may be more easily led to own the same necessity common to all causes. So basically the point here is that if we stop thinking that the universe has some necessary connection, causal power in it that's lacking in our own experience of our thoughts and emotions, and rather take the same kind of approach both to our internal states and their relations and external states and their relations. Take the same approach to both, okay? We'll find that there's a regularity to what we see, both in what happens out in the external world and what happens in our internal world. And that regularity that we see just is cause and effect. That's what it is for things to be causally determined. So determinism is just the reliability of patterns of constant conjunction that we've experienced in the world before, both in the external world and the internal world. And that's fully compatible with the belief that we ourselves can make a decision or can set our will a certain way and will act in the way that we set our will. Those two things are perfectly compatible